Welcome back to the journey of exploring the hidden corners of history. Today, we will not only look at maps or dry numbers about ship tonnage, we will look deep into the souls of two men separated by an ocean of ideology and a cold steel wall of the United States Navy. Most of you know the official history of the Battle of the Atlantic, the dry numbers and dates. But behind those facts is the story of an obsession that completely changed the course of the Second World War. This is the story of the USS Pillsbury and the submarine U-505 told through a lens you have never seen before. It was April 9th, 1944. Captain Daniel Gallery stood on the bridge of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal watching a steel funeral. 700 yards away, the German submarine U-515 was breathing its last. It was a perfect kill, exactly as the military textbook described. Depth charges from the USS Pillsbury and her sister ships detonated without pause, creating rhythmic thuds like the heartbeat of an apex predator. When the submarine finally surfaced, it looked like a torn-apart monster leaking oil and blood into the Atlantic. Gallery watched through binoculars as the German crew scrambled out like ants fleeing a flooded nest. In just a few minutes, the hunter became a ghost, its bow pointing toward the sky before it slid silently into a 2-mile-deep abyss. For everyone else on that bridge, it was a victory worth celebrating with coffee and cheers. But for Daniel Gallery, it was a heavy, aching failure. As the bubbles from the sunken submarine faded, Gallery felt an emptiness in his chest. He was no longer chasing the number of ships sunk. He was chasing a key. He knew that every time a German submarine vanished into the depths, it took with it an enigma, machine codebooks, and technical documents that held the power to end the war. In 10 months, commanding this hunter-killer group, he had watched his men do exactly what they were trained to do: destroy the enemy. But as the war dragged on and the casualty list from Allied convoys grew longer, Gallery realized that the Navy's standard operating procedure was a death sentence for thousands of merchant sailors. Destroying was easy, but capturing was an art no one in the US Navy had practiced since the War of 1815. The obsession began that very afternoon in the quiet of his private cabin. Gallery stared at the maps, realizing the Atlantic was a graveyard of lost information. Naval headquarters in Washington considered his idea of capturing a submarine a suicidal fantasy. They argued that the Germans were too well trained, their scuttling procedures too fast, and the risk of a booby-trapped submarine far greater than any potential intelligence gain. But Gallery saw what they did not. He saw the human factor. He understood that even the most disciplined sailor still had an instinct to survive. If he could create a moment of extreme chaos that made a German commander forget the mission to destroy the boat, he could seize the ultimate prize. He began secretly training Lieutenant Albert David and his small boarding party on the stern deck of the Pillsbury. It was a strange sight to the rest of the sailors. While other ships drilled gunnery and depth-charging David's men practiced jumping onto moving targets, navigating tight dark corridors, and identifying German sea valves by touch alone. There was an undercurrent of mockery among the veteran sailors. They called it the Suicide Squad. They could not understand why their captain wanted them to charge into a sinking bomb instead of fleeing from it. But Gallery did not care about the whispers. He was a man obsessed with a single vision. The war would be won or lost in the few short minutes between a submarine surfacing and its final plunge. He was no longer just a ship hunter. He was a secret hunter waiting for a German commander arrogant enough to keep the boat afloat 1 second too long. June 4th. 1944 began like any other Sunday in the middle of the Atlantic, with sunlight reflecting off the restless gray sea. But beneath that surface, the machine of death was running. The task group was technically heading for port, their fuel was running low, and for a moment it seemed the hunt was over. Then, at 11:09 in the morning, the silence aboard the USS Chatelaine was shattered by a sharp metallic ping. It was the sound of fate. A German submarine was operating just 12 miles from the carrier, moving like a ghost toward the center of the American fleet. What followed was not the slow, calculated warfare of the previous months, but a violent, frenzied explosion of power that forced Daniel Gallery's long-nurtured plan to collide with reality. As depth charges from the Chatelaine and circling Wildcat fighters began pounding the water, let us shift focus into the steel tomb of the U-505. This is where we meet Harold Lang. In this retelling, Lang embodies Prussian discipline, a man who saw his submarine not as a machine but as an extension of his own iron will. Inside the hull, the world was turning into a nightmare of shrieking metal and shattering glass. The depth charges were not just explosions. They were physical blows that bent bulkheads and sent high-pressure oil spraying like black blood from cracked lines. Lang stood in the middle of the control room, emergency red lights casting long, grotesque shadows across his face. He could hear his boat dying. He could hear the ocean clawing at the pressure seams. In that moment, training told him to dive to vanish into darkness, but the damage was too severe. The rudder was jammed. Batteries were leaking poisonous chlorine gas. He had no choice but to blow the tanks and face the executioners on the surface. When the U-505 broke through the waves, it looked like a wounded whale gasping for air. On the Pillsbury's deck, Albert David did not wait for orders. He saw German sailors spilling out of the conning tower, hands raised eyes wide with the terror of men who had just stared into the mouth of hell. This was the moment Gallery had obsessed over. The American ships should have kept firing until the target disappeared, but the order crackled over the radio like lightning. Ceasefire, capture the boat. To ordinary sailors, it sounded like a death sentence. The submarine was still moving in a tight, erratic circle, its engines straining its deck slick with diesel, oil, and seafoam. It was a floating bomb, rigged with scuttling charges that could detonate in any microsecond. Albert David and his 8 men lowered a whaleboat into the churning water. As they rowed toward the spinning submarine, the scale of their mission became terrifyingly clear. They were not just boarding a ship, they were invading a foreign world actively trying to sink itself. David was the first to reach the rail. He grabbed the cold oil-slick steel and hauled himself onto the deck, his boots sliding over the ruins of battle. He did not look at the German prisoners jumping into the water. He did not look at the aircraft circling overhead. His eyes were locked on the open hatch of the conning tower. Beneath that hatch was a maze of darkness filled with the roar of rushing water and the ticking of clocks that might be tied to explosives. As David stood at the edge of the abyss, staring down the glowing red throat of the submarine, he felt the enormous weight of the mission. Every second he spent on the deck was a second the Germans could be turning a valve or pulling a lever to send them all to the bottom. He drew his pistol, took a deep breath of the salty sea air, and jumped down. He did not know whether his feet would land on solid deck plating or plunge into a flooded compartment. He did not know whether the first thing he touched would be a codebook or a detonator. This was the trigger point. The plan was no longer a theory written in a cabin. It was a desperate gamble being played in the dark, wet belly compartments of an enemy ship. Above them, Daniel Gallery watched from the Guadalcanal, his heart pounding, knowing he had just sent 9 of his best men into a steel coffin to chase a secret that might already be lost. The space inside the U-505 was a cathedral of suffocation lit only by the bizarre, painful deep red glow of emergency lamps. When Albert David's boot hit the metal deck, the sound echoed like a gunshot through the hollow belly of the beast. The air was a thick, choking mix of diesel smoke, spilled battery acid, and the sharp, metallic scent of fear. Water was no longer just leaking. It was screaming in through a seawater intake valve the Germans had opened before fleeing. For any ordinary person, this was the sign to run to scramble back up the ladder before the Atlantic reclaimed its gift. But David and his men were no longer just sailors. They were surgeons operating on a dying patient rigged with explosives to self-destruct. The tension in those first minutes was thick enough to choke on. While David's men rushed to close the main sea valve, they were effectively playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with 13 powerful demolition charges hidden throughout the boat. Every shadow looked like a trap. Every small trickle of water sounded like a ticking countdown. They moved through the control room and into the radio compartment, flashlight beams cutting through darkness to reveal the Allied intelligence, Holy Grail, Enigma machines. They were still bolted to the table, their rotors frozen mid-secret that could save millions. David felt a surge of adrenaline so intense it hurt. This was the prize Gallery had promised, but the price of keeping it was a constant, gnawing fear. The submarine was heavy, sluggish, and listing hard to the stern, acting like a massive steel anchor, dragging them all into a dark, silent grave. As the Pillsbury began the slow, painful process of towing the captured submarine toward Bermuda, another kind of conflict was forming aboard the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. Harald Lang, the German commander, had been hauled from the water, trembling but defiant. He was not a man who had collapsed. He was a man waiting for his boat to obey its final order and explode into fragments. Gallery ordered Lang confined in a separate cabin away from the other prisoners. He did not want a public interrogation. He wanted a psychological siege. He needed to understand the man who had nearly taken these secrets to the bottom of the sea. For the first time, Gallery stood outside the heavy steel door of the cell, listening to the silence on the other side. The wall between them was only an inch of American steel, but it represented 2 worlds that could not coexist. Gallery entered the room without guards, carrying only 2 cups of coffee. It was a calculated move, an opening gambit in a game whose stakes were the survival of Western civilization. Lange sat on the edge of a folding bunk uniform, soaked eyes blazing with a mix of hatred and confusion. He had expected to be questioned by a brute, but instead he faced a man who looked like him, spoke his language, and understood the sea the way he did. The silence stretched, as if for hours, broken only by the carrier's engine hum. Gallery did not ask for codes. He did not ask about military positions. He simply sat down and talked about the ocean, about the way light looks when you surface at dawn. He was searching for a crack in the Prussian armor, a way to bridge the chasm between two enemies who in essence were just men trying to survive the madness they had created. The atmosphere in that small cabin was suffocating and strangely intimate. Outside, 3,000 sailors had sworn to keep a secret that would define their lives for the next decade. No letters home, no diary entries, no whispered stories in bars. The U-505 had become a ghost ship, and its commander was now a ghost in a steel cage. Gallery realized that capturing the boat physically was only the beginning. The real battle was happening here, in the silence between two men who knew a single word could change the flow of history. As the sun set over the Atlantic, the tow cable between carrier and submarine tightened, a physical expression of the bond between hunter and prey. Gallery looked at Lang and saw the reflection of his own obsession. Both were prisoners of duty, locked in a dance of ghosts, where the prize was not a ship, but truth itself. The middle of the Atlantic at night was absolute emptiness, making it feel as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. On the darkened deck of the Guadalcanal, the only world that mattered was the dim circle of light Daniel Gallery and Harold Lang shared. Gallery took a massive risk by bringing the German commander out of the cell and up onto the deck. It violated every security protocol, but Gallery knew walls only fed defiance. To break a man like Lang, you did not need a baton or blazing floodlights. You needed stars and the crushing weight of truth. They stood near the railwind, snapping at their coats, watching the black, hunched shape of the U-505 being towed a few hundred yards behind. It looked like a chained monster, a captured shadow of the Third Reich, following a new master into the unknown. Gallery leaned against the cold metal eyes fixed on the horizon. He began to speak not as a captor, but as a fellow traveler at sea. He spoke of the Atlantic's terrifying beauty of the pressure crushing down when you dive deep, and the lonely, silent responsibility of command. He was weaving a web of shared experience, trying to remind Lang that before they were enemies, they were brothers of the sea. But Lang remained like an ice statue, his jaw set, his gaze locked on his captured boat. He told Gallery that his men had betrayed the Führer by failing to sink the boat, and that he himself was as good as dead in the eyes of his homeland. There was a tragic nobility in his voice, the sound of a man who had bound his entire identity to an ideal now visibly collapsing around him. The conversation turned when Gallery introduced the idea of legacy. He asked Lenga what he wanted his children to remember him for, as the man who successfully destroyed a machine, or the man who recognized when killing had to stop. Gallery pointed at the submarine and told Lang that inside that hull were secrets that could prevent 10,000 other mothers from receiving the grief telegrams Langa's torpedoes had caused. He was not just demanding codes, he was asking Lang to choose between a dead ideology and a surviving future. The psychological pressure was immense. Lang turned to him, eyes reflecting pale moonlight, and asked why an American officer would care about the soul of a German U-boat captain. It was a moment of raw sincerity, stripped of rank and uniform. Gallery's answer was a masterclass in manipulation and empathy. He told Lang he cared because both of them were part of a machine that had gone mad. He admitted that if the roles were reversed, he too would hope for a captor who saw him as a human being, not just an intelligence source. He spoke of the merchant ships Lang had sunk, specifically mentioning the troopship Ceramic and the hundreds of civilians who died in freezing water. He did not use it as an accusation, but as a mirror. He forced Lang to look at the human cost of that discipline. For the first time, the German's composure wavered. His hands gripping the rail began to tremble. It was not fear of the Americans, it was the sudden, violent rise of a conscience long suppressed by years of naval tradition and propaganda. The silence that followed was heavy, with the realization that the steel wall between them was beginning to melt. Lang looked back at the U-505, and for a fleeting second he no longer saw a weapon of the Reich. He saw a coffin he had miraculously escaped. He saw the faces of his crew now sleeping in the carrier's belly, safe from war because of a decision made in chaos. Gallery saw the crack in the armor and chose not to push further. He knew some truths needed time to breathe in the dark. He called the guards to take Lang back to the cabin, but as the German turned to leave, he paused. He did not hand over codes or reveal secrets, but he looked Gallery in the eye and said, "Thank you for the coffee." It was a small gesture, meaningless to anyone else, but to Gallery, it was the sound of the first screw on the Enigma secret beginning to turn. The fragile human connection forged under Atlantic stars was shattered the next morning by the cold, relentless rhythm of a top-secret dispatch. A classified message from Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, landed on Gallery's desk like a grenade with the pin pulled. Washington's highest Navy levels were not celebrating. They were terrified. Capturing the U-505 had triggered an earthquake in the Allied High Command. If German High Command so much as suspected the submarine had been captured, instead of sunk, they would change every Enigma setting, every codebook, and every signal protocol immediately. This would not just mean losing a trophy. It would blind the Allies just as they were preparing for Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings. Gallery was informed in harsh terms that he was no longer a hero. He was a man holding a ticking time bomb that could destroy the entire D-Day invasion. The pressure inside the captain's cabin became suffocating. Gallery was given 48 hours to extract the most critical intelligence or sink the boat and the prisoners to ensure absolute silence. The threat of a court-martial hung over him like the sword of Damocles. But Gallery's crisis was not just career-related, it was moral. To get information in such a short time, traditional interrogations would fail. He looked at reports from the Pillsbury, where Lieutenant Albert David was still struggling to stabilize the flooding. German scuttling charges were still a danger, and the secret location of the latest Jongig acoustic torpedo manuals was still unknown. Gallery realized the steel wall he had tried to melt with coffee and stars now had to be pierced by something sharper, the brutal reality of the clock. He returned to Lange's cabin, but the atmosphere had changed. This time there was no coffee. Gallery spread out nautical charts of the English Channel and the French coast. He spoke with a cold professional urgency. He told Lange the invasion of Europe was imminent and that thousands of people, Allied and German, were about to die in a firestorm. He explained that if Enigma was not fully broken, the war would drag on another year and the German cities Lange loved would be turned to ash. This was no longer a conversation between two sailors. It was a confrontation between a man trying to save the future and a man clinging to a ghost. Lange remained defiant, his face like a stone mask, but his eyes betrayed a deep pain from within. He was being asked to help engineer the defeat of his own country to save its soul. As the final hours ticked away, Gallery resorted to a desperate psychological gamble. He allowed Lange to see the American codebreakers working on a captured Enigma machine through a reinforced glass window. He let Lange witness the frustration of American mathematicians as they hit a dead end because of a missing rotor setting one Lange knew by heart. Gallery watched from the shadows, studying the German commander's reaction. He saw Lange's lips move a silent prayer or a silent curse as he watched the Americans struggle. The tension was a tangible presence in the room, like a string pulled tight to the breaking point. Lange was not just watching the enemy, he was seeing the inevitability of history. He knew the Americans would eventually find what they needed, but every hour they failed meant more submarines would be sent out by a desperate Berlin on suicidal missions. The climax of this psychological siege came in the final hour of the deadline. Gallery stood before Lange and issued the last ultimatum. He did not threaten Lange's life, he threatened his memory. He told Lange that if he stayed silent, the U-505 would be sunk. The crew would be sent to a nameless prison camp, and the world would believe they died as failures, unable even to sink their own boat. But if he helped, if he provided the missing link, he would be the man who helped stop the slaughter. Lange stood up, his frame trembling under the weight of a choice no man should have to make. He looked at the glass window, then at Gallery, then back at the charts. The silence in the cabin grew so thick it felt as if the air itself had turned to steel. In that moment, the fate of the Atlantic Hunt and the Enigma, secret hung by a thin thread of human conscience. The final hour was not marked by a heroic confession, but by a mechanically cold silence. Gallery stood in the shadows as Lange approached the reinforced glass eyes fixed on the Enigma machine, on the table like a mute idol. The American codebreakers were exhausted shirts soaked with sweat, fingers trembling as they tested thousands of failed combinations. They were missing the daily key, a piece of information that changed every 24 hours, keeping the Reich's secrets locked in a mathematical tomb. Gallery watched Lange's reflection in the glass. The German commander was no longer looking at the enemy, he was looking at the tool of his own destruction. The steel wall inside his mind was screaming under the pressure of Gallery's words about the human cost of the war. The turning point came when Gallery stepped closer and spoke in a low, steady voice about the ceramic the ship Lange had sent to the bottom. He did not describe it as a target. He described the freezing water, the cries of civilians, and the absolute silence after the waves closed over their heads. He forced Lange to realize that his silence was not an act of patriotism, but an act of complicity in an endless cycle of killing. In an instant, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Lang's hand slowly rose, fingers hovering over the glass as if he were trying to touch the machine's rotors. He did not speak a word of betrayal, but his eyes tracked the hands of the American operator. In a moment of profound psychological surrender, Langa's gaze stopped on a specific sequence of numbers. On a nearby chart, a subtle, unconscious nod that Gallery caught with hawk-like precision. Gallery did not wait. He signaled Albert David, who was connected via secure radio from the belly of the U-505. Guided by wordless clues and logic drawn from Lang's reactions, David moved toward a hidden compartment near the captain's bunk, a space the Americans had missed in the initial search. With a crowbar and a prayer, David pried open part of the wooden paneling. There, snug in a waterproof zinc box, was the Holy Grail, short signal codebooks and special settings for acoustic torpedoes. David's crackling voice came over the radio, filled with exhaustion and victory. They had it. The secrets of the U-boat fleet were no longer an unknown. They were a map to the war's end. As that realization spread through the room, the tension snapped like a dry branch. The American codebreakers began moving with new, frantic energy. Fingers flying over keys as meaningless German character strings suddenly became sharp, clear intelligence. They were reading the positions of every German submarine in the Atlantic. They were reading defensive orders for Normandy. They were seeing through the enemy's eyes. Gallery looked at Lang, expecting the face of a defeated man, but instead, he saw a man who looked as if he had just shed a 1,000-pound burden from his shoulders. Lang had lost his boat, lost national secrets and military honor, but in the wreckage of failure, he found a spark of humanity. He chose the living over the dead. The climax was not a victory of weapons, but a victory of the soul. The U-505 was no longer a threat, it was a library. When the first successful decrypts were sent back to Washington, the threat of a court-martial vanished, replaced by stunned silence from the top command. Gallery had proven that his suicidal fantasy was the most important intelligence achievement of the entire war. But standing there watching the machines hum and papers fly, he did not feel like a conqueror. He felt the heavy, somber price of truth. He looked at Albert David, his face smeared with grease and grime, then looked back at Lang. The war would continue, the killing would not stop tomorrow, but the steel wall had been breached. The secrets were out, and the Atlantic tide had finally turned irreversibly toward the light. The victory of the U-505 was not welcomed with parades or blaring trumpets. When the captured submarine finally reached the port of Bermuda under the cover of a moonless night, the atmosphere was a solemn, heavy silence. For Daniel Gallery, the mission did not end when the boat docked, but with enforcing an absolute silence that could not be broken. 3,000 sailors were assembled on the task group's deck, and Gallery looked into their tired, salt-worn faces. He told them they had achieved something historic, something that had saved countless lives, but they could never tell anyone. Not wives, not parents, not even their future children. To the world, the U-505 had to remain a ghost, a ship that had simply vanished into the blue sea. This was the final steel wall, a barrier built from human loyalty and the burden of a secret. Harold Lang was removed from the carrier that same dark night. As he stepped onto the pier, he stopped and looked back at the USS Guadalcanal, then at the battered hull of his submarine now being repainted with American numbers. He was a man without a country, a commander without a crew, but there was a strange peace in his eyes. He had faced the mirror Gallery held up and chose to stop being a weapon. He vanished into a secret POW camp in Louisiana, while his family in Germany was officially told he was missing and presumed dead. For 3 years, he would be a ghost living in the quiet of the American South, while the world he knew burned and rebuilt itself. The dialogue through the steel wall ended, leaving a legacy buried for decades. The true tragedy of this achievement was the fate of those who led it. Lieutenant Albert David, who leapt into the dark throat of the submarine and held its beating heart in his hands, never lived to see the day this secret was revealed. He died of a heart attack in September 1945, just weeks before he was scheduled to receive the Medal of Honor. He died without ever being able to tell his newborn child that he was the only sailor in the entire Battle of the Atlantic to earn the nation's highest military decoration. He remained a silent hero, a man who devoted his life to a secret that saved millions. Gallery himself carried the weight of Admiral King's warning for the rest of his career. He won the intelligence war, but he lost the innocence of a purely military victory. Now he understood that the strongest weapon was not torpedoes or bombs, but information harvested from the human soul. Many years later, when the war was only a faded memory and the last secrets were declassified, the U-505 was brought to Chicago to become a permanent memorial. Since then, millions have walked through its narrow, dark corridors. looked at the very enigma, machines, and sea valves David and his men once touched. But they could never truly hear the whispers of the two men who stood on the windy deck in the middle of the ocean, arguing over the value of a human life. The story of the Pillsbury and the U-505 is a reminder that even in the most brutal conflicts, the human spirit can still find a bridge across the steel walls of hatred. It is proof of the truth that understanding the enemy can sometimes be more powerful than destroying him. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the shadows of the Atlantic. If the story of these silent heroes and the heavy price of secrecy moved you, please help us preserve these memories by hitting like and subscribing to our channel. Every interaction helps ensure that the sacrifices of men like Albert David and the bold vision of Daniel Gallery will never be forgotten. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, whether you're in the US, the UK, or anywhere in our global community. Do you have a family member who served in the Navy or a secret story of your own you want to share? We would love to hear from you. Hold on to the silence of the past, but share the stories of the brave. See you next time. Stay strong, stay curious, and never stop searching for the truth behind the steel. Goodbye.